So in high school, I was a very avid long distance runner. I got into cross country and track and fell in love with the activity of just going out and for hours grinding, regardless of the weather, just putting in the steps. And what I loved so much about running long distances was simply the beauty that I could correlate how hard I worked in practice to how well I was going to perform later. And so in my mind, this very isolating activity where you go and you run 10, 15, 20 miles a day on your own, and you're not necessarily running with anybody else, you're just out there with your mind. I found that to be, a lot of people find that very lonely, like the loneliness of the long distance runner. I found it incredibly empowering. And I loved the the brutal masochism of hurting in practice so that in the race you can make others hurt. There was like this beautiful romantic relationship that I had with running, and I ended up running for a couple of years in college as well. And throughout that time, one of my heroes was this guy named Steve Prefontaine, who you might not be aware of if you're not a runner, but he was America's greatest long distance runner back in like the 60s and the 70s, and he died very tragically at like the age of 24. So there's a lot of what ifs about his life and his career, but he had an approach to running which was really romantic for a teenage, young, adolescent male like myself. And there's a couple of lessons that I want to share with you that have had a really big impact on my life, not just in business, but also just how I approach relationships, how I approach any activity that I think if you were to take these, they would serve you incredibly well. So the first idea that I want to share with you is this idea that the hay is already in the barn. And what I mean by this is going back to Steve's early days, he was the type of runner he loved making other people hurt in a race. He would always talk about how, you might beat me, but you're going to have to hurt to do it, right? And so he was a grinder in practice. And that type of mindset, that type of mentality is really hard to harness. It's really hard to pull those type of people back. This type of runner, this type of individual who's going to be successful in life, they don't need anybody propelling them forward. They don't lack the discipline. They don't lack the motivation. So as a coach, your job isn't to try to motivate them to go harder in practice. Your goal, your job is actually quite much harder. You have to get them to go less hard. You have to pull them back. And his Steve's legendary coach was Bill Bowerman, who was the original like shoe designer for Nike, and he had a famous quote, which is in the weeks leading up to a race, as a runner, you would start to taper down the mileage. You would go maybe from doing 50 miles a week down to 40, down to 30. You would do less speed work, and you would just, keep the body moving and feeling good. But what that does for a runner who's used to running very high mileage for, all the rest of the year is it fills you with this anxiety. And you have all this time now because you're not out there running all the time. You just, a 5 mile run. You're like, okay, now what do I do? Right. And so there's a lot of pent up energy. And a lot of times runners will make the mistake of going too hard during that taper period, and they'll compromise the quality of their race because they just couldn't pull back enough. And, Steve was one of those guys, and Bill one day just looks at him and he says, "Hey, Steve, listen, the hay is already in the barn." And what that meant is in that final 2 week period before a race, there's nothing that you can really do that's going to dramatically improve the quality of your race. You're not going to get fitter in that 2 week period. You might get a little bit sharper, but the benefits of resting far outweigh the benefits of any additional work because the hay is already in the barn. And the way that I've applied this to the rest of my life is, when I go, let's say, and give a keynote on stage to 1,000 people, I do a ton of practice and rehearsal in the weeks and months leading up to that event. But in the couple days before the event, I don't really look at the speech. I don't really practice it anymore. I don't really think about it anymore because the hay is already in the barn. I've already done the work. And life gets really good when you do the work in preparation for the big event and you know that the hay is in the barn. Now, if you haven't been doing the work and you're trying to cram it all into that last 2 week period, then good luck, my friend. You're going to get your ass kicked in the race. The second thing that I learned from Pre is how you win matters more than if you win. And that might not be strictly true at the highest levels of the game, right? Like if you think about it, gold medal gets all the gold, whereas second place, they get the silver and nobody really remembers who they are. So at the highest levels, winning is what matters. But for Pre, how he won mattered more than whether or not he won. And so he would run the types of races that were not designed for him to win. Like, he would do it the hard way. He would run from the front and he would try to break people. So instead of just like drafting and tucking into the back of the pack and letting somebody else lead, because there's a big disparity, there's a lot more difficult to lead the race than it is just to follow somebody else. And this is the same in cycling and the same with car racing. You know, there's drafting, and that's a very real thing. Psychologically, it's just that much easier to be the follower than the leader. But Pre would never do that. He would never sit and wait for it to come down to a kick at the end of the race. He would lead from the beginning, and he would set a brutal pace trying to break people, even if that meant that the person he was actually most likely to break was himself. Because at the end of it, he could live knowing that he ran that way, not as a coward, not sitting and waiting, but actually going out there and trying to break people. That was how he wanted to win. And if he won any other way, and that wasn't it, then it wasn't a victory for him. And I think about this a lot because when I was 12, I won the South Dakota State Chess Championship. And it was an important moment in my young life, not because of the win, but because of what happened afterwards. I got into the car with my dad, who hadn't been at the event with me, and I put the trophy in the back seat, and he looks at me and he asks, just, how did you do? And I said, I won. And he responded, good, you were supposed to. And I remember that put a chip on my shoulder for many, many years. And it set the expectation that I needed to be the best at everything that I did. I needed to win at all costs. And it wasn't until many years later that I actually could understand the intention behind my dad's question wasn't, did you win? Or like, he doesn't asking, when he said, how did you do? He didn't mean like, did you win? Right? There's a difference between winning and doing your best and like performing well. And the truth is, in that event, I won, but I didn't play particularly well. I didn't play up to my abilities. And it would have been the equivalent of Steve winning a race, but he didn't run it to the best of his ability. He didn't run it the way that he wanted to win. And I think about this a lot in life because more so than getting to the top of the mountain in my experience has been how you get to the top of the mountain. And it's the same with rock climbing. I think it's one of the things that really attracted to me to that sport is that there are countless paths to the top of a mountain, to the top of a cliff. There are countless routes, some easier, some harder than others. But climbers intentionally pick the one that's right at their limit so that they can challenge themselves. It's not very much fun to climb a mountain that's not a challenge, right? Just getting to the top actually isn't very much fun. It's the journey, it's the struggle that you encounter on the way. And so climbers are constantly calibrating and trying to climb the most difficult thing that they can do. And it's an arbitrary path to the top. And yet in that arbitrariness, it's everything. It's the only part that matters. And so I think about this a lot, like in business and making money, is that it doesn't matter how much money you make. It matters how you make your money. It doesn't matter what you sell. It matters how you sell it. It matters the impact that it can have on people's life. And I think the more that you think about that, the more you can tie your activities on a day-to-day basis to doing your best rather than trying to get to this end result that will deliver something that will impress people or allow you to live a different kind of life or whatever, like focusing on where you are day to day. And that leads me then to the last thing, which is Steve would say this: it's not who is best, it's who can endure the most pain. And I think about this. This is his quote directly. He says, a lot of people run a race to see who is the fastest. I run to see who has the most guts, who can punish himself into an exhausting pace, and then at the end to punish himself even more. And I think about this through the lens of the man who likes to walk will walk further than the man who's simply walking towards a goal. If you can fall in love with the activity of running, with the activity of hurting, with the activity of enduring, and that's the goal in the race, isn't to make it as easy as possible. That the goal is actually to make it hurt as much as possible. And when you connect it to that, then in the middle of the race, when you're hurting, you don't try to back away from it. You go towards it because you go, oh, the goal, the pain was the goal. Now, I'm not saying you need to be a masochist and go seek out pain in your life, but understand that, for me, I hate writing, but I love having written, right? I love the output of the writing. But the more that I connect myself to the act of writing and seeing this is a painful thing, and it's excruciating to take my thoughts and try to extract them and put them down into words in a coherent manner, the more I fall in love with that process, the better the writing, the better the work ultimately becomes, and the more likely I am to actually show up and do the work. And so I share these ideas with you because they've had a profound effect on my life. Steve was an amazing human from an athletics perspective. He had a movie that Jared Leto starred in back in I think it was the 80s or 90s. It was a long time ago. Very, very good. He has a book called The Story of America's Greatest Running Legend that was written by Tom Jordan. Highly recommend that as well. Dig into his life. You can learn a lot by studying successful people and how they thought and how they approached their craft. And I hope one of these ideas, one of these stories serves you well on your journey. And if not, then I'll try again tomorrow. But until then, stay hyper-focused, my friend.